One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast, and I'm your host, Emily Van Knet. SKYLIT Books is an independent bookstore located in Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. We are open every day, Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. for curbside pickup and masked in-store browsing. You can also shop online at www.skylitbooks.com, and you can check out all of our great virtual events we've been doing on our Crowdcast page. Just search SKYLIT Books. Now, onto our show. We are excited to have Liz Brown here to discuss her new book, Twilight Man, Love and Ruin in the Shadow of Hollywood and the Clark Empire. Her writing has appeared in Book Forum, Design Observer, Elle Decor, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, and New York Times Book Review. She's joined today for a conversation with Alex Ross. Alex Ross has been the music critic for The New Yorker since 1996. His first book was the international bestseller, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won a National Book Critics Circle Award. His second book was the essay collection, Listen to This. His third book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, was published last year, appearing on Best of 2020 lists in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the Financial Times. In 2008, he was named a MacArthur Fellow. So we'll begin today with a little reading from Liz from her new book, Twilight Man, followed by a discussion with Alex Ross. Enjoy.
Thank you. I'm going to read a passage from the first chapter of Twilight Man, and it's not actually about the Twilight Man in question, whose name is Harrison Post, but it's about the Clark mining empire that he fell into, and about Will Clark, who would become his eventual lover. Few people in America have been born into such riches, and yet Will's first year was marked by sorrow. He was only a few months old when his 2-year-old sister Jessie contracted pneumonia. She died in April 1878, weeks after his first birthday. Montana may have been the origin of the Clarks' phenomenal wealth, but it was also where the family buried 2 children. That fall, they sailed for France. Paris was in the midst of its own boom, having emerged from the Battle of the Commune. In the Tuileries, gardeners tended the once scorched, now blooming gardens. Up on Montmartre, workmen toiled on the white dome of the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, rising against the skyline. Hot air balloons floated above the Seine. Will and his family arrived in a city newly illuminated with arc lamps. Far from the belching smokestacks and pits of roasting ore, 13 million people flocked to the Exposition Universelle, where they heard Alexander Graham Bell's telephone ring and Thomas Edison's phonograph warble. In the Trocadero Gardens, visitors walked inside the colossal copper head of the Statue of Liberty, the new republic's gift to commemorate America's abolition of slavery and its embrace of independence. Just a few months later, in January, Edison patented the incandescent light bulb. The electrification of the world had already begun, and now the pace quickened. Telegraph wires, telephone lines, light sockets, all needed the red ductile metal that Will's father was pulling from the earth. or rather his legions of miners were extracting, doing the dangerous poisonous work of scraping and plunging and smelting, while acrid green smog filled the air in Butte, and sulfuric soot settled on the grass and coated the windowsills, and the Clark fortune continued to swell. For 13 centuries, from the coronation of Clovis I until Louis XVI was stripped of his title in 1792, France had had a king. Since then, the country had roiled between revolution and backlash, republic and empire, until finally, after the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III was deposed in 1870. The French monarchy might be over, and yet the imperial impulse still lived on. It wasn't driven by the divine right of kings, but of capital. America called itself a republic, but as Will's father proved, if a man owned enough of its resources, along with its banks, postal services, and utilities, he might as well consider himself sovereign. In Europe, Will's father had discovered a new game, collecting art. Among the vestiges of faded empires, he could imbue his New World wealth with Old World prestige. He gathered up the remnants of the bygone dynasties to decorate his palace back in Butte. Tapestries, rugs, vases, ceramics, stained glass. While his wife, Kate, remained with their children, cosseted by nannies and governesses and tutored in French and German, as befitting royal issue. Will's father began a ritual of seasonal migration. He spent most of the year in America, presiding over his growing kingdom, returning each winter to his family. 6 years passed, and it was deemed time for the Clark children to come back to America, to learn their own language, to discover how much they possessed. 20 years before, Will's father had driven a team of oxen from Missouri to Colorado, when the nation had consisted of 25 states wrenched apart by war. Now it had been knit back together and stretched from one end of the continent to the other. The railroads hurtled people and goods across the land, prosperity bloomed, and much of it belonged to Will's family. And so the day came when his mother took him to Grand Central and sent him off alone across the country to Los Angeles, where his grandmother lived and his aunt ran a school. At the end of the journey, when the boy finally arrived, he alighted at a 2-story wooden depot surrounded by freight yards, pasture land, and mountains. It was quieter than Paris, quieter than New York, quieter than Butte. Not that Will would have had much memory of the raucous mining town. Los Angeles had grown at a different pace from the rest of the country. No waterway or harbor had designated it a strategic spot for trade. No mineral rushes had swept through. No smokestacks fumed. Adjacent to the frontier, but apart from the boom, Los Angeles had idled. It was a ranching town. The mining years had been good ones. The demand for beef in the foothills had been constant. But these pastures weren't a destination for fortune seekers. A small housing boom had spurted and fizzled a decade earlier. The former Pueblo's rhythms belong not to the incessant propulsive churn of industry, but to seasons, to grazing schedules and harvests. That was about to change. There would be men like W.A. surveying the arid hill of Butte who intuited the riches to come. They understood even better than the copper baron how people and their desires were raw material to be turned into commodity. Harrison Gray Otis, a farmer's son from Ohio, had just been made editor of the Los Angeles Daily Times. Within a few years, he'd blanket his Midwestern homeland with pamphlets, advertising the orange groves and mountains that now greeted young Will Clark. The town had to pay a $600,000 subsidy to persuade Southern Pacific to build a depot, since Los Angeles wasn't already a center for trade or industry. But Otis had foresight. Eventually, they'd tear down the modest depot and build the arcade station in its place. all the better for a picturesque welcome among William Wolfskill's orange groves. Staging was essential. None of this meant anything to Will. For the boy, Los Angeles was simply where his grandma lived. The carriage wheels clacked over the road. Water trickled through the zanjas, the ditches irrigating the town. 3 mountain ranges ringed the Los Angeles basin, like a cup tipping into the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't granite and quartz and streaks of metal beneath the earth's crust, but a Cretaceous slurry of sand and oil. Here, land was as unfixed as land could be, and yet the boy was secure, safe within his father's extraordinary realm. They trundled past Los Angeles Park, once a camp on the western outskirts of the old pueblo. Now a white picket fence kept out stray cows and sheep. A church steeple rose high above 2nd Street. A new grid had been laid down over the one the Spaniards had built a century earlier, as if no one had been there first. His grandmother lived on Olive Street, named for the trees that lined the road. Their silvery leaves glinted in the sun. Olive was the same word in French and English. Will was there to learn his native language, just as Los Angeles was about to learn its most enduring lesson, to sell itself. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Liz. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about this amazing book. And yeah, I was just so transfixed by this narrative. We know each other, and you'd already told me some bits and pieces of the narrative, and I knew a few bits and pieces myself, but it's just astonishing how many different worlds this book is going to take you through, and sort of this world of Montana and the mining and this kind of shadowy, gangsterish world of mining and politics and in Montana, and then you shift to Los Angeles, and it sort of moves into this kind of this Hollywood and Bohemia and the kind of gay netherworld, and then it sort of, I won't spoil the remaining parts of the book, but it just spirals into it's a roller coaster ride. You have no idea where it's going to go next. But it's just an extraordinary story of America, I suppose, and rapid transformations of America, and also about money and how money drives people insane and turns them, makes them do horrible things. So there's just many layers to it. But yes, to start off, I mean, how did you discover this story? And of course, you have your own connection to this fascinating and strange family, the Clark family. And if people know any member of the family, it's probably Huguette Clark, who was the famous miser, a woman who died at a very advanced age. And there are all kinds of interesting stories told about her. But yeah, tell about how you stumbled across this tale.
Sure. Well, thank you for all of that. I had, my grandmother was the niece of Will Clark Jr., the Will that I just read about. And it's a connection by marriage. He had married her aunt, and she was named for that aunt, Alice McManus Clark, and was sort of doted on by Will and Alice, and was kind of a surrogate daughter to them in a way, and spent a lot of time with them in their mansion in West Adams in Los Angeles, and traveled with them. And then when her aunt died, she in 1918, Will still stayed in her life and was sort of this benevolent figure. And so I would hear about Aunt Alice and Uncle Will as a kid growing up, but they were very distant, and it was, nearly a century had passed, I guess, or maybe not that much time, but still a couple generations. And then my grandmother passed away in 2003, and I had come out to my parents a few years before, told them I was gay. It had not been an easy revelation for either of us. And we were at a prolonged impasse for a long time when I came back from my grandmother's funeral. And I was just sort of drawn to try to find some kind of heirloom or something of her, a trace of her in her house. This was in San Francisco where she lived. And I found this photograph of this gorgeous young man, 1922, inscribed to her. He looked like Rudolph Valentino. And nobody knew who it was. So I just took it and I said, okay, this is what I'm taking. And then independently, I knew that there had been these whispers about Uncle Will possibly being gay. And I knew there had been this very sensational book that had been written about the Clark family in the 40s by a disgruntled former employee, and that the family had tried to buy up all the copies. And so independently, I started hunting down that book, and it's called The Clarks, An American Phenomenon, and it's by William D. Mangum, who had been Will Clark's secretary or accountant. And I found the book, and I was reading the book, and I came across this passage that referred to, the unnatural vices, the perverted practices, like various heightened language for Will's homosexuality. And then I came to the part where it talks about his estate and how he had divided it up, and that the bulk of it, or one of the largest bequests, was to his perverted disciple Harrison Post. And that was how I put together that photograph was my great uncle's lover, and that for whatever reason I felt I needed to save it. I wanted it. And by then, my grandmother had passed away. I couldn't ask her anything about it. And I don't know if she would have been comfortable with me asking about it, but she also kept that photo for 80 years. So
it was in a drawer in her
dresser in her bedroom, So I started kind of just pecking away at this story. And then the librarians at the Clark Library here in LA were very helpful, and they said, yeah, we've heard a little bit about Harrison Post. He has a strange story. And then they pointed me toward a woman. They connected me with a woman in the Bay Area who turned out to be it's very hard to track all these connections. It's all very circuitous, but she turned out to be the niece of his foster sister. He had these journals and scrapbooks and address books that had Carol Lombard and Greta Garbo in them. And as I was researching this, I started to discover his story was a kind of rags to riches to rags to, I don't know what you would call it. It's like a fairy tale where he sort of is a shop clerk that meets Will Clark and is swept into this fabulous, wealthy world of wealth. And then he becomes prey for his own family, who end up blackmailing, extorting, and taking over his fortune. So that's half of the book.
Right. Yeah. So it's basically, just to sort of, so the money comes from William Andrews Clark Sr., who just makes an absolute, just monstrous load of money in Montana with copper mines and sort of all kinds of other investments. And so a lot of it goes to Will Jr., who moves to LA, who's gay, and who really devotes himself to the arts and music. He's the founder of the LA Philharmonic, and he builds up this extraordinary collection of Oscar Wilde manuscripts, which become the core of the Clark Library, which is a splendid building. And then some of the other money goes to Huguette, which is a whole other, we don't even need to
Yeah.
get into her, but that's a completely bizarre tale. That's been told. There's been a sort of book about her. But your side of the story, it's, I just love how it just sort of keeps subdividing, because first you have this incredible, larger than life sort of charismatic monster, the father, with just this huge energy and ambition and sort of will to dominate, and then there's Will, who sort of comes across as sort of this, quite charming, character at first. He's gay and sort of, just loves culture and sort of wants to kind of use the money to sort of support culture. But then there's sort of shadows that sort of begin to gather around him as well, which I think for you, I mean, this was sort of a turn that it took for you as you told the story, because at first you were thought, well, let's just tell the story of this kind of, this wealthy kind of gay man who was sort of surrounded by scandal at a certain point, was sort of almost the sort of victim of circumstances, but then kind of you became more uneasy about him as a figure as you went along, right?
Yes, I did. I thought I was going to recover a gay romance. That
Right.
I thought, I am restoring this forgotten, neglected, buried, excluded history. And that's in there, that's a kernel of it, but I found that kernel is located inside of this much larger, darker world. My initial response to the book by Buck Mangum was very suspicious and very oppositional. I felt like I was writing a counter narrative in a way, because he's just so virulent in his homophobia and his animosity. But as I started to dig and as I started to see a progression in Will's own biography, he was, on the one hand, this wonderfully benevolent person, and then you start to discover he has these demons. I don't know, that's maybe a nice word. He seems to have he takes an interest in his housekeeper's son that is, I guess the term we might use today is problematic, but he just starts to become this darker figure, and you realize that he has grown up with a capacity for corruption and privilege and entitlement. And for as much as he was a lovely uncle to my grandmother, he was also, on the other hand, taking advantage of his power over people who didn't have any power. And that's the picture that he starts to become a very tormented and dark figure, and yet he was persecuted at the same time, right, for being gay, and it's tangled. I wanted to write a gay romance, and halfway through I realized, no, I'm writing this massive tragedy of legacies of corruption and predation.
Right. And just have money. I mean, even though he was gay and had this marginal and extremely vulnerable status because of being gay, because he was so immensely wealthy, he could protect himself from persecution, unlike sort of most gay men and lesbians at that time. And also he could sort of use the money to get what he wanted and get whom he wanted, maybe in a way that he didn't even realize how it was. Correct. He may have had a more innocent picture of himself, but I'm sure that the relationship with Harrison is interesting because it begins as a kind of romance. I mean, they're lovers, but then it sort of evolves into something else.
Yes.
Even if there may be other younger men who are part of Will Jr.'s life, he continues to support Harrison, and there is, they seem to turn into a friendship or a kind of, that relationship seemed to be kind of pretty benevolent all the way through, and
Yeah.
wasn't it? Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
And ended up getting this incredible bequest.
Yes, I sort of started to think of their relationship as a template, and that he had met Harrison when Harrison was a shop clerk in San Francisco. Harrison was about 22, and there was a 20-year age gap, and he swept him off to LA, where Harrison then became this kind of Hollywood socialite who swanned about with movie stars and other society figures. And their bond remained strong the entire time, but I do think it, what may have been romantic and sexual then became something more about a companionship. And I know I have the impulse to kind of map our contemporary versions of relationships onto this one and say they were partners or something, but I feel like the best word is kinship for what they established ultimately. And I think in a lot of I don't know if I would say non-normative, but I do think that in a lot of homosexual friendships, relationships, like there are these gradations of intimacy that sometimes include sexuality, sometimes include romance, friendship, and that in a way there's more of there aren't these delineations that say are so familiar to us through heterosexuality, that are so clear cut. And I think, Oscar Wilde is a presence in the book. And I think, even though his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas was extremely contentious and in a way destructive, I also think they sort of give you a kind of template too of something that has this very intense romantic aspect, but it isn't only that. And they certainly, their sex lives extended to other people. They weren't they weren't a monogamous couple, in that sense.
Right. Yeah, and people have, now been asking the same questions about Oscar Wilde himself and his predatory capacity, even as he was victimized and sort of sent to prison. So it's just many kind of layers of complexity.
Yeah.
So, and then there's Harrison himself, who really emerges as the central figure of the book. I mean, he is the Twilight Man, but first we go through the Clarks and their history before he really enters the scene, and he really feels like the hero of the book in a lot of ways, a sort of a tragic hero, but he is pretty much an innocent, and he's surrounded by sort of people who run the gamut from sort of monstrous to problematic to just bizarre, to his own family, who are an incredible bunch of people, and yet he himself is kind of he just seems to be sort of drifting along, and he's so lucky at first to have stumbled into this, and then he becomes so unlucky. His fate is again, I don't want to give away anything, but it's quite miserable. But how, who was he really, and where did he come from? Which he sort of emerged from the shadows and sort of take on various guises. He seemed to like kind of play acting or sort of adopting different personae.
Yes.
Who was he really?
He was born Albert Weiss Harrison, and his mother was the daughter of a theater impresario, or opera house impresario from Galveston, Texas. So from his mother's side, there was a legacy of wealth, but from his father was a clothing salesman from Russia, and had immigrated, I think, at a pretty early age, and they married and divorced very early, and he was sort of bounced around with this kind of itinerant, charismatic but alcoholic salesman father, and he was in the vicinity of wealth his whole life, but never quite in his whole early life, but never actually possessed it. And I think of him as as this naive figure. I almost think of him sort of like, as the anti-Ripley in a Patricia Highsmith book.
Right.
Like, he just has no ability to kind of strategize his way out of, everyone else strategizes and sees him as this mark, as a kind of target. And he almost, in some ways, he feels so un-American to me, because he's not driven in that way. He's kind of a dreamer. He's not this hustler. And he sort of lands in this incredible wealth, which will ultimately trap him. But I think if he at some point he decides he wants to be he might be a bookbinder. Another point he decides he will own a hotel. He just sort of drifts, and he seems like a man out of time in a way.
Yeah. And there's kind of, I had this strange feeling that at the same time there was kind of this contentment with him, or kind of an acceptance of just whatever stage of his life. He just seemed to kind of somehow move along and not become consumed. I mean, the injustice that was done to him,
yes,
is just staggering. What his family did to him, and then he was in Norway during World War II, and there's Nazis, and it's just, just the circumstances of his later life. It's often just really, really sad, and you're enraged on his behalf, and he's trying to, at the end of his life, he's trying to get it back and sort of fighting for it, but at the same time, it never feels like he's completely consumed by it. He's just this sort of beautiful moments, kind of later in life, where he's just kind of just still living day by day and in a way, kind of drifting along.
Yeah, it really was an incredible thing to discover these journals, and which are from the last 4 years of his life, I'd say. They begin when he has tried to escape his predatory blackmailing sister by fleeing to Norway, which is where he ends up, thinking he's finding sanctuary, just in time for the Nazis to invade. And then more misfortune befalls him. And yet also he is incredibly lucky. He doesn't get killed by the Nazis, but he is put in internment camps and subject to all kinds of horrible things there. But even there, he has this kind of naive belief that things are going to work out. And some of the most amazing parts of this process were the research and the discoveries of just discovering these journals, or discovering there's a POW memoir written in Norway that includes a chapter about Harrison.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And to see that author's view of Harrison was wonderful, and just to see him in these camps and his kind of enduring all this misfortune, and yet also having these moments of kind of moments of sublimity, where he's listening to men sing and kind of transported. He's not an easy one to pin down,
Yeah, but he is a very appealing figure to the end, and you need that, because the rest of your book is just kind of every face of kind of human monstrousness you can think of, and the buddy just kind of bringing that out of people, in ways that are just not surprising, but just dismaying to read about. But at the center, you do have this guy who just seems to have been just a pretty good guy in a lot of ways. I
think someone I thought about as a kind of parallel for him was Lily Bart in House of Mirth, who is more driven and has her schemes and whatnot, but is also this kind of tragic dreamer who keeps wanting something a little bit better and stumbling into adversity after adversity, and getting kind of pushed to the margins of high society. And in a way, I feel like Harrison has those kinds of parallels where he just wants it. He just has these hopes, but doesn't know how to make them happen.
Right. Yeah. How did sort of going through all this how did it affect you in the end, in terms of after years of immersion in this and it having, a connection with your own family as well? Did you where did you feel it sort of left you in the end in terms of, I suppose, how you fit into all this or
well, that is a good question. I'll say off the cuff, I'm definitely still figuring that out. But I had a really lovely phone conversation with my mother last night, who has just started reading or is halfway through, and was very full of it, concerned about how she was going to read it, and she so far has embraced it, and that's very lovely. And where I fit in, in the epigraph, it is a quote from Antigone. The book, I have it right here, and it's I have been a stranger here in my own land all my life. And I chose that because it's true of Harrison. He's this sort of stranger in his own land, but also because Antigone is the story of a woman who comes to bury her brother. And I think on some level, there are all these sort of, you could call them mystical ways I came to this story, but on some level, it started to feel like there has been this deep wrong to this man, and he needs to be put to rest in a dignified manner. And kind of, I guess, coming back to kinship, that there are these forms of kinship that aren't necessarily biological, but they're very deep, and they're, in this case, I guess, intergenerational, and so I sort of think of it like, and there are all these women there's several women that kind of appear in the story who take care of him. And I feel like, I'm part of that legacy of kind of coming in and trying to help this man through his strange journey.
Like his friends in San Francisco at the were looking after him, and just that it is this wonderful feeling of sort of restitution for someone who just got buried by this steamroller, and has ended up being this kind of, mentioned here and there as sort of this figure that you sort of snicker about, the sort of the rich man's young gay lover, and and to sort of show his full history. It does feel like righting a wrong. In terms of the other side of that, I mean, so Clark's name is on the library here in LA, and he has the status as the founder of the LA Philharmonic. How do you feel people today should consider him and reconsider him in terms of his place? Does he need to be kind of, how do we talk about him now?
I don't know. I think in a way, I mean, there are aspects of his life and things he did may have perpetrated against other people that I don't think are excusable. And so I don't necessarily think he's someone we need to put on a pedestal. At the same time, he seemed to know that in his own life, and he avoided a certain degree of public recognition. The statue in Pershing Square that's to commemorate him here in Los Angeles is a statue of Beethoven. It's not of him. And he sort of seemed to have this instinct to hide himself, especially at the end of his life, to kind of shrink away. And he was sort of disentangling himself from the LA Philharmonic at the end. So he almost, won't say he was canceling himself, but he receded.
And he was tormented, as you say. I mean, not necessarily, can't necessarily say that he felt remorse, but,
yes.
But he was just a very troubled man. And it wasn't that he was just obliviously preying on people and having a great time. It was just very complicated. And
he seemed to be spreading taking his misery out on other people. Right. I don't know. I wonder if our need to venerate actually gets us. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot about philanthropy today and the names on all the buildings, and a kind of question is, what are you all hiding, and why do you need your name on a building? Because you're probably doing something like addicting millions of people to opiates.
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
For
I just
instance.
finished reading Patrick Keefe's Empire of Pain, which is a truly shocking story of real ruthlessness. So that's a sort of in a different category from someone like Clark, who's not ruthless.
No, I don't think he was.
Father is another matter.
but he was definitely of his world, of the Clark Empire, and he learned. He did learn to leverage his power.
Right.
And he's not, in my mind, he's not a hero. I don't know that he's I don't think I would say he's a black and white villain. But he does I do think he does some monstrous things.
It's a book that kind of asks you to look at history in all its complexity, and not black and white. I mean, there are some black and white villains in the book, no doubt, but so much of it is tortured and complex, and you feel this. It's fascinating to feel a mixture of compassion and disgust or with condemnation toward someone like William Clark Jr. But this is sort of, this is how we have to look at history in a way, and this is how the future will look at us. And so much of our world is still riven by these same issues. So it's I just felt it was a book that sort of takes us back into the past in a way that's just not at all simple, and full of layers and full of conflicting emotions, but also a story, just an incredibly gripping story, because you just really don't know where it's going to go next. No one could have invented all this. It wouldn't work. It would have been, if you'd been writing a novel and you sent a chapter to your editor saying, okay, now he's going to Norway and the Nazis are about to invade. The editor would say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. But it happens. Yeah.
It would not be acceptable as fiction. It would not be believable at all.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much, Liz. And I just absolutely urge everyone to read this astonishing book. It will just give you a different view of Los Angeles and just this period of American history and kind of our whole strange species.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. That was such a great conversation. Again, Liz Brown and Alex Ross discussing Liz's new book, Twilight Man, which is available now. And yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining us. This has been the SKYLIT Books podcast, SKYLIT, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitebooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see